Okay, I'm going to show you how to cover paperback books. First, I like to get the size that fits 1 inch over the book, but I don't currently have that size. So I'm going to need to cut down a piece. So the procedure is the same whether it's a larger roll or a smaller roll. For measuring, you measure so that the book, there's laminate 1 inch over the book. And then you cut the laminate. And as I said, I don't have a roll that fits. So I'm going to measure, I want about 1 inch extra all the way around. If you do too much more than that, then the laminate tends to get caught on itself as you're working with it. All right, and then I like to, my procedure is kind of a combination of other people's procedures. One moment. Okay, so I've just folded over a little bit of the covering to begin my process. Now I line it up according to the grid, and I want 1 each on each side, or approximately, and about 1 inch sticking off the edge. And once I feel I've gotten about that, then I push just the front of the book down, and then I flip it over and I take my straight edge and I make sure that it has a good start. Now, because I folded that, I have to kind of pull it off because there's a, and then once it's off, it will easily push down onto the book. A lot of the other videos tell you to remove the paper and put the book down. I find that this method keeps the laminate from getting as many bubbles. There still might be bubbles, and I just push them out. This particular book has a little bit of water damage, so I'm having to straighten it out a little bit more. But you can see it does a pretty good job not getting bubbles. Then I cut off the very corners. And I cut in here because that piece will fold under, but you need to not go to the all the way to the edge because of the binding part of the book will interfere with being able to fold that piece over. So I just cut at an angle and probably 1/4 of an inch from the binding. And you saw I left this on. I'm just going to pull this off now that I'm ready to work with it. Then I pick it up and I start by kind of pushing it along on the edge just to get it started on that edge. And again, I take my flat edge and I push it down. The more you do with your fingers, the more likely you are to end up with bubbles. Just start it with your fingers and then use your flat edge. I find that it prevents more bubbles. You do that on all 3 sides. You can't see this, but I'm just doing the same thing here. And then I also use the end of it to kind of make sure that it's all pushed down. Then I take these corners that I cut off previously and I go back in. Whoop. And this is actually pretty forgiving until it's been down for a while. So if you don't get it aligned real well, you can kind of pull it up, at least initially. After it's been down a while, it's harder to pull it up. And so that just helps seal those corners. All right, Now I've got the front cover done, and sometimes around these labels, if you just take and push it down before you start wrapping to make sure all the bubbles are out, because once you start wrapping around, those bubbles are harder to get out. So again, I use my fingers on smaller areas just to push it down, but I'm pushing it around at the same time so there's not a lot of extra hanging over. Sometimes when I get to this point, it'll adhere a little bit, and you can just take this edge and pull it up a little bit if you need to. Same thing. I start by pushing it down, making sure I'm getting a good seal, and this is the point at which you can kind of pull it up if you didn't get a good start. Once you got a good start, you just kind of push the paper off as you're pushing the laminate on. And you can see it does a pretty good job. There was a piece of tape on this book, it looks like. Now that's underneath there. I'm just gonna leave it. But around these labels, in order so they get scanned well, I like to push them down to make sure they're sealed and there's no bubbles around it. Same procedure here. I'm cutting my corners off. Pulling it off, starting it with my fingers just to get a good edge, and then pushing it down with my straight edge. Once in a while I get a little mark, and sometimes you just gotta let it go. You can do so much, and then just some of the details are not as important. Forgot to cut this side, so I'm going back to cut it. And you can see I didn't get quite as much on the bottom as the top, and that's not a big deal. You do want some overlap. If there's not enough overlap, it's more likely to come off as kids are working with the books. So you don't want it too tight. All right, and then to finish it off, again, I didn't mention this before, but you want a really sharp scissors because the plastic is sometimes resistant with dull scissors. And then you get shards of plastic kind of sticking out and sticking to other things. So you want to start with a nice sharp scissors, a good flat edge that's about the width of the book, or that you can work with pretty well. And then I like the middle of the road laminate. I don't like the real thin stuff because I find that it folds over on itself, but I don't like the real thick stuff because I don't find that it goes around the edges and over these edges well. You end up with a 1/4 inch hanging over because they don't want to bend as well. So that's the process I use for laminating a paperback book.